So you're the one who know what you're talking about.
I'll give you both the handheld microphones
Thank
there.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, start? Okay. So, hello everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here with you today. Today marks the third day of the COP27 here in beautiful Sharm el Sheikh, which is home to the very precious ecosystem that we have here in Egypt. And at the same time, we also see and feel the impacts of climate change on our marine life and most importantly on our health. And we are here today and to discuss and see how health and climate change can be addressed because as we all know, and this was announced 7 years ago, that climate change is the single biggest threat to our global health of the 21st century. But at the same time, climate change offers health opportunities and co-benefits to us living in a better, healthier, and greener world. And I would like to, before I start my session, is to also acknowledge that here we have many incredible partners, Reaching the Mile, Welcome, and Community Jameel, which have brought together researchers, policymakers, as well as donors to discuss the critical climate and health emergency, and at the same time demonstrated an excellent leadership in the multidisciplinary way for us to address the climate crisis. So I'd like to first of all introduce our inspirational guests, and we're so happy to have you with us today. We have Her Excellency. I sincerely apologize. Yes, Mariam. Yes, Her Excellency Mariam. I would like to say correctly, not just Mariam bint Mohammed Al Mehri, UAE Minister of Climate Change and Environment. And at the same time, I would also love to introduce Sir Tony Blair. First of all, he is the former British Prime Minister, and right now he's also the director of Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. So I'd like to first of all start our discussion, and my first question is to Your Excellency. We know that UAE has demonstrated such an inspiring leadership in addressing climate change, and I would like to hear more from you how this was led, first of all in UAE, as well as regionally and global efforts for climate change.
Thank you, Amnia, for having us. Thank you so much for all of you being here, and it's such an honor to be here with Your Excellency. And first of all, let me tell you all, the UAE has been on this journey, or the climate action journey, at least for 3 decades. Our leadership saw the writing on the wall and understood many years ago that we must diversify. We must diversify our economy, and this comes, of course, with diversifying our energy sources as well. And so we've been on a pathway, and I'm sure some of you will see some of the exhibits here. For many years now, we set up Masdar City in 2006 as a flagship company that actually invests in renewables. We went on. IRENA is hosted in the UAE. We were the first to sign and ratify the Paris Agreement in 2015. From then on, we've had a lot of milestones, and just before COP26, we announced our intention to hit net zero by 2050. And so we've been working hard in the past few months to get the private sector on board to ensure that we go on this pathway. And by the way, in a few days' time, we're going to be announcing some detailed information of how we're going to get to net zero by 2050. So in a nutshell, we have been investing a lot abroad and in the country on this journey. We've been advocating for all the actions on the energy side, but also on the food side. We're also not just having to transition our energy sector into more renewables, but also looking at food systems transformation. At the same time, also looking at the environmental side. What can we do to enable or empower and make nature our ally, and use the power of nature to help us combat climate change? So we like to see ourselves a little bit as a trendsetters. We like to see us as a beacon of hope for the young people in our region, because climate change is real. It is happening now. It is affecting all our lives, and we must take action today.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And it's very true how trend-setting it is, and very inspiring to see how UAE has tackled not just the just transition, which is such a significant agenda, but also food insecurity, which is one of the greatest threats that are facing our health, especially the health of the younger generation. And I would like to ask Sir Tony, so we know how climate change is a multidisciplinary crisis. And to adapt to the effects of climate change, we need the behavioral change along with the people, and we can see that especially in the younger generations. But we would like to hear your thoughts about that, and also how can we replicate the urgency and the action we're seeing in people's actions and behavior across the ministries, so to the policy-making level.
Yeah, thank you very much. And first of all, it's a great pleasure to be with you and to be with Dr. Maryam, to thank her for her leadership and the leadership of the UAE in this space. Because I remember very early discussions when Masdar was first founded. Everyone was quite skeptical as to whether they could make a huge impact. They actually have, and I've seen it in many different parts of the world. So, here's how I look at this. It's very clear, if you're in a position of political leadership, that you've got to protect your people. You've got to allow, if you're a developing country, you've got to allow your country to grow. You can't, certainly from the developed world, go to a poor African country and tell them, as a result of climate change, which we created, you've got to forestall your development. So the way that we get the behavioral change that people want is, in my view, through two things. It's through the development of technology, because in the end, the only answer to climate change will come through technology. And, we've got a lot to be confident of in this respect. I mean, if you look at wind and solar power, when I was in office, many people still said at that time this was completely unrealistic. It was never going to be competitive. It wouldn't work. And now today it is highly competitive. In time, for example, we'll have the storage capability that gets rid of some of the problems when renewable energy can't provide your baseload power. The UAE, by the way, is going to be, I think, a leader in the hydrogen space as well, which will be immensely important. So technology is the first thing. It's not about telling people they can't consume. It's about telling people they can consume differently and sustainably. And I think it's so important that we do that. Otherwise, you get into an argument where you'll end up putting political leadership against people. And from a long experience in politics, I can tell you that won't work. The second thing, however, is this, that we need practical plans that allow the developing world to develop sustainably. And there are two aspects of that. So one part is the developing world that has already got energy, right? And there is energy transition. So if you think Indonesia or Vietnam or India or indeed China, right? They've already got energy, but it's energy mainly through fossil fuel. You want them to transition. But then you've got a second group of developing countries whose issue is not energy transition because they don't have energy. So, half the population of Africa has a very, very difficult time getting access to energy at all. There the question is, because a lot of them have fossil fuel resources, how do you make it viable for them instead to go down the clean energy path? Because, as I say, they are going to develop, they're going to need energy. And that brings me to the point, which is the only way you get transition and then sustainable development for countries that don't have energy is through the financing mechanisms that allow you to make it actually in the interests of people to go and invest, whether they're international financial institutions or private finance, in that energy change. And that's the second part of it. And both of these things, technology and financing, they need a practical frame of mind. And I think in my view, the one great thing that the UAE will be able to do next year with its COP is show people practical ways forward on these big issues. Because if you don't solve those practical questions, all you have is strong words and weak actions. And what we actually need are strong actions, and the words can take care of themselves.
Thank you. And Your Excellency, you have touched upon very important aspects when we think about technology, and most importantly, climate finance. And this is what we're aiming here at COP to try to mobilize, because we say that this is the implementation COP, but for us to do that, we need the necessary climate finance to see how the pledges and the commitments can be translated into actions on the ground. So I will turn to Your Excellency, and you've identified many different and instrumental examples, but if you would choose the 3 top priorities for you as the UAE Minister of Climate, and if you would focus in the context of climate change and human health.
Okay, if I have 3 areas, the first area would be adaptation capacities. So we need to invest in adaptation capacities. What I mean is, when you think of climate change in relation to health, you always want to make sure that whatever happens to a country, they have power, they have water, there's a means of transportation, and there's communication ability. So this infrastructure needs to be adapted to become more resilient. So for example, in the UAE, for example, when we now build a little bit higher than we would have built a few years back. Why? Because as we know, sea levels are rising. This is an adaptation of making sure the infrastructure is okay in the next coming years. So adaptation capacities are really important, and not just putting the standards, but also making sure that the people who are using the technologies are also adapted to this. So we've got to skill up. So this is a big subject in itself. Second, we need to find a way to prevent contamination of food and water. So essential, because we see that whenever there's a crisis hit, it's the food and water that's really, really important. Again, this comes down to the basic needs of humans. And then, of course, addressing the impacts of climate change on our food systems. I think that's also a very important role. For those of you here, first of all, it's lovely to see so many faces here. And I also want to take the opportunity to thank Egypt for hosting COP27. And we're big supporters of them because we're taking on the baton after that. And so understanding that food systems is not just about producing food. It's about every single one of us on how we behave around food. What you buy, what you put in the bin, all affects the food security, the global food security. So I need all of you to think about that. Can we all actually go home and try not to put any edible food in the bin? I actually had this exercise, and it's not as easy as you think. You need to put efforts into changing that. So I think because we're connecting climate change with health, our food systems and our behavior around food is really, really important. So I think those are the 3 areas.
Thank you, and I hope each one would take that challenge back home. And it's so important because I've recently come across the Lancet Countdown report that was released 1 week before COP, and it calculated that in 2020 alone, there were over 90 million people worldwide who are suffering from acute food stress. So it's a global crisis, and at the same time, it's important not only to address the